Coming up here on CNN Newsroom, Israel's political Houdini looks set for a second act, but at what cost? Benjamin Netanyahu's return as Prime Minister will be possible after he made a deal with far-right Jewish extremists. He didn't concede, he didn't congratulate, but he did speak. And many in Brazil breathed a sigh of relief as Bolsonaro agrees to a peaceful transfer of power. And from one international pariah to another, Iran looks set to supply more combat drones and now ballistic missiles to Russia.
Live from CNN Center, this is CNN Newsroom with John Vause.
While official results from Israel's election are expected in the next day or so, it appears, according to exit polls, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is on the verge of another political comeback, an outcome which is stunning but not surprising, especially given the surge of support from the ultra-nationalist far-right wing. The former ruling Likud party also increased its presence in the Knesset, or parliament, with party faithful celebrating an expected return to power, as well as the resurgence of Benjamin Netanyahu.
One thing is already clear. Our way, the Likud's way, has proven itself. I remind you that from 52 seats in the last election, we are now on the verge of a very big victory.
Netanyahu's comeback was made possible by a coalition deal he made with the far right, in particular religious Zionism, which is likely to have more than doubled the number of seats it holds in the Knesset. But all of this comes with an asterisk, if the Israeli television exit polls are in fact accurate. For Netanyahu, the support from the far right gets his potential coalition government over the line to a very slim majority, 61, maybe 62 seats in the 120-seat parliament. But the acting Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, who rose to power as the leader of the anyone but Bibi bloc, is clinging to one last hope, that the exit polling is wrong.
This night may go on for 2 days. Until the last envelope is counted, nothing is over or closed. We will wait patiently, even if we don't have patience, for the final data.
Live now to Jerusalem, journalist Neri Zilber is with us for the very latest on the elections, as well as some analysis. So thanks for coming in at this early hour. Okay, so if Netanyahu is to form this coalition government, in theory, it should be more stable politically, less infighting, because this bloc would be politically and ideologically aligned, which is kind of what Bibi's been selling. Here he is.
I intend to form a strong, national, steady government. I think the atmosphere has changed. I can feel it. I hear from the people, and they say, we now want the real change. We want to return the state of Israel to the place it deserves. And I intend to do it, together with my friends.
So unlike the previous coalition government, which started out with, 62 seats, lasted just over a year, again, in theory, this could put an end to what has been 4 years of election addiction. What are the chances of a return to some kind of normalcy here?
That's right, John. Netanyahu on the campaign trail in recent months was selling precisely that. Big banners with his face and the Likud party logo. Only the Likud can. Telling the Israeli public that only the Likud could actually form a majority and stable government, a coalition government here under Israel's fractious parliamentary system. And according to the exit polls, as you mentioned, that's the more likely outcome. And we should also say, yes, he's going to form, or most likely form, this governing coalition with what he has termed his natural partners on the Israeli right, the ultra-Orthodox parties, and yes, the far-right religious Zionism party, which is set to be his most senior coalition partner.
Yeah, in fact, we just heard from Netanyahu talking about forming this government with his friends. And his friends are, in fact, that hard-right party, the religious Zionism. And Haaretz reports that the victory celebration last night for religious Zionism, witnesses say the crowd chanted, "Death to Arabs," alongside the more prevalent calls for death to terrorists. The party said the crowd only chanted "death to terrorists." This party was once considered too extreme for mainstream politics. It wants to end Palestinian autonomy in parts of the West Bank. The party's leader talks of deporting disloyal citizens and politicians. It's well known for his anti-Arab rhetoric. And as you say, it's now the second senior partner in this coalition, potentially, the third biggest party in Israel. Is Israel on the road to becoming the next Hungary and Viktor Orban?
Well, look, that is a concern amongst large portions of the Israeli center and left, and even amongst the Arab-Israeli minority, which makes up 20% of the Israeli public. So yes, it is a concern because it's not only Ben Gvir and religious Zionism that are touting a lot of these what they call quote-unquote reforms of Israel's judicial system. It's Likud members and officials themselves who are talking about undercutting the independence of the Israeli judiciary and the Supreme Court, undercutting the power of the Attorney General, and even just over the past 2 hours, senior Likud official said he would outlaw the flying of the Palestinian flag in Israel and revoke the citizenship of any terrorists, and presumably only Arab terrorists, not Jewish terrorists. So yes, there is concern there. On the face of it, Netanyahu is trying to project a more moderate image tonight, trying to assuage some concerns amongst the wider Israeli public, to say nothing of the international community, which is closely monitoring any potential future Israeli government consisting of extremists like the religious Zionism party.
You touched on this. Religious Zionism wants to rewrite parts of the legal code. Not all of it, just some of it, like the corruption laws, which Netanyahu is accused of breaking. So what he allegedly did would no longer be illegal. Nothing shady about that. Netanyahu's Likud party is also happy to go along for the ride. Listen to this.
I want a right-wing government, and although I have my differences with Ben Gvir, we have a lot in common, and I would like to see a right-wing government that could rule and make all the changes and reforms in the judicial branch. And yes, Ben Gvir is a partner to that.
Separation of powers is such a novel concept. Will religious Zionism have an outside influence in this potential coalition? It'll be the second most senior party there, but overall, will it be sort of taking the lead, if you like?
I think that's a good way to put it, John. It really, over the past year and a half under the change government led by centrist Yair Lapid and various other centrist and left-wing factions, there was a constant campaign by Netanyahu and his far-right allies to delegitimize this government precisely due to the fact that it had Arab-Israeli political parties as part of the governing coalition. And really, this has been a far-right Israeli talking point for many years, and it was adopted by Netanyahu and his Likud party. So really, it's the Frankenstein monster, as it were, has almost taken over the House, and Netanyahu will be beholden to religious Zionism and its agenda if and when he forms his next government, which seems likely after yesterday's vote.
Neri, thank you so much for being with us. There's a special place in heaven for people who get up at 6 a.m. for live shots. Thank you.
My pleasure.
South Korean officials say North Korea has fired at least 10 missiles early Wednesday morning. 3 of the 10 were short-range ballistic missiles. One landed around 60 kilometers off the south coast, prompting air raid warnings on a remote South Korean island. The provocative launches also drew a sharp rebuke from South Korean military officials.
This missile launch marks the first time since the division of the peninsula that has landed near our territorial waters south of the northern limit line. It is very rare and we can never tolerate it. Our military will firmly respond to it.
The launches follow warnings from Pyongyang on Monday for the US and South Korea to stop their large-scale joint military operations, which began this week. He speaks. He didn't say much, which was oddly out of character, but it was just enough for many in Brazil to breathe easy. It took 2 days for outgoing President Jair Bolsonaro, we can say that now, outgoing, to break his silence after losing to the leftist Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Bolsonaro gave a speech from the presidential palace on Tuesday where he promised to abide by the Constitution. Notably, he did not explicitly concede defeat, but the far-right leader's chief of staff says he's been given the green light to work with the incoming government, signaling Mr. Bolsonaro's cooperation with the peaceful transfer of power. Brazil's Supreme Court says the outgoing, there it is again, president effectively acknowledged his loss. But as CNN's Paula Newton reports, some Bolsonaro supporters are still not convinced.
As President Jair Bolsonaro prepared to finally break his silence, police forces across the country moved to break up hundreds of blockades, snarling traffic, slowing supply routes, and rattling already frayed nerves. Police were acting on orders to use force, orders that never came from Bolsonaro himself. Instead, in a terse 2-minute statement, he said he would respect the Constitution, but he neither admitted defeat nor recognized the results of the election. and had this to say to supporters blocking roads across the country.
As manifestações.
Peaceful demonstrations will always be welcome, but our methods cannot be those of the left, like property invasion, destruction of goods, and restrictions on the right to come and go.
On the barricades, some of the protesters mounting insurgent campaigns nationwide had this to say.
This was a statement where he didn't say anything conclusive. It gives us the impression that there was something wrong with the elections. That is a plus for us to continue our stand and keep protesting.
Many here say they are committed to a patriotic cause, standing up for the president they elected.
Country and freedom. Just that. We don't accept those who won, not just us, but a large part of Brazilian population.
These protests, sporadic, unpredictable, and yet effective, are taking a damaging toll on this fragile economy and more. This trucker was stuck on the road overnight, and his wife fell ill and had to be taken to hospital.
Personally, I'm against this. The people have made their choice. If they wanted to lock things down, they shouldn't do it to business. People have to work.
Even among officials that back Bolsonaro, there is a great reluctance to support any kind of civil disobedience. It's the reason that they have ordered these blockades to end, even if police have to use force. They do not believe that these kinds of protests will resolve any of the division in the country.
There will not be a demonstration or a riot that will make society not recognize the result of the polls. To the victors, the mandate; to the losers, the acknowledgement of defeat.
After a bruising campaign and a vague signal from Bolsonaro that he will give up power to President-elect Lula da Silva, Brazil seems destined for more political division, now playing out on its streets and jeopardizing an already tense transfer of power. Paula Newton, CNN, Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Brian Winter is Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly, as well as Vice President of Policy for the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. Welcome back, Brian. Good to see you.
Good to be back.
Okay, in terms of concession, recognizing defeat, affirming it was the other guy who won, this was as close as we got to that on Tuesday, and it wasn't from Bolsonaro. Here it is.
President Jair Bolsonaro has authorized me when prompted. Based on the law, we will begin the transition process.
That's Bolsonaro's chief of staff, and apparently by agreeing to the transition of power, legally that's seen as tacit approval of the election results. So why talk around the outcome, a nudge here, a wink there? Why not just congratulate the winner? There was once a time when if you weren't gracious in defeat, it was political death.
Yeah, that's quite an old-fashioned thing to say, unfortunately, in my view. I mean, look, what we saw today was as close to a white flag as we were ever likely to see from President Bolsonaro and his allies. It's true that Bolsonaro did not congratulate Lula, did not explicitly recognize his defeat, but he did say that he would obey the Constitution, and he authorized his chief of staff to say that the transition would soon be underway. And for those of us who have spent months now, if not longer, worrying about the possibility of an institutional crisis, of something similar to what we saw in the United States following the 2020 election, this was a pretty big sigh of relief. It's not a perfect situation, as you point out, but it could have been a lot worse.
It took 2 days to come up with that 2-minute speech by Bolsonaro, and there is some reporting that he was actually locked in negotiations to try and ensure that both him and his family are not prosecuted once he is out of office. Bolsonaro does have some legal concerns. There's everything on the table from corruption to the mishandling of the pandemic. How much weight do you put into that reporting?
That sounds true. I mean, I think the story of what happened during these 48 hours where President Bolsonaro remained totally silent, I think that story remains to be told. But what I'm hearing and what's being reported in the Brazilian press was that it was, in the end, it was his allies who prevailed upon him to at least come out and at some level acknowledge the result. And they have reason to do that, because even though Bolsonaro lost, his conservative movement came out of this election pretty strong with a lot of political capital. Governors aligned with Bolsonaro will run Brazil's 3 most populous states. I think all of his former ministers who ran for Congress won in their elections. And so, a lot of his allies were saying to him, look, we know that you're upset. Yes, we agree with you that the system was against us, again, in their view, but let's live to fight another day.
Bolsonaro also made reference to the electoral success by the right-wing parties in recent elections. Here it is.
A direita surgiu de verdade.
The right really emerged in our country. Our robust representation in Congress shows the strength of our values: God, country, family, and freedom.
President-elect Lula da Silva is already facing some pretty big challenges. How much harder will all of this be without a politically aligned Congress?
Oh, I think it's going to be really hard for Lula. Expectations are somewhat high just because Lula, who was president, of course, from 2003 to 2010, that was an era of bonanza for Brazil. The world is much more difficult this time around. The global economy is harder. Brazilian politics are harder. It's a much more conservative country than it was before, where he's going to be facing, having to negotiate in some case with parties that, at least for now, are working with Bolsonaro. So, I think a lot of the left and people who were worried about democracy in Brazil, they breathed a big sigh of relief today, but it's not going to last for very long.
The other unknown in all this is how Bolsonaro's supporters will react. They've been manning hundreds of roadblocks on highways across the country. That's in defiance of a Supreme Court order to clear the way. New York Times is reporting this. Protesters said that they were trying to create enough of a disruption that the military would intervene, enabling the president and the armed forces to overturn the election. That seems straight out of the Donald Trump election playbook, which would suggest, Bolsonaro's loyal followers are far from ready to go quietly into the night, just like Donald Trump supporters.
I do think at the same time that things de-escalated today. The risk of massive violence, the risk of some sort of concerted effort to either overturn the result or make life really difficult for Lula from day one. There will be some voices who will be out there seeking chaos and confusion, but I don't think it's going to be the majority. I think that things really did get better as a result of the events of the last 48 hours.
It does seem like the pressure was let out of what was a very stressful, tense moment there. But Ryan, thank you very much for that. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Still to come here on CNN. Oh, the dilemma. When you're an international pariah and running low on missiles, where do you go for new supplies? Another international pariah. Also ahead, the trials are underway, the very public trials of anti-government protesters in Iran.